Hey Barry. Uh, so for anyone listening, this is a kind of a question and answer session with Barry, where we wanted to go through kind of just some theoretical topics that might be relevant to scholars for how they might use the crowd data center's data. And we might weave into some topics that are just interesting for us to cover. And we'll be going through some headlines of research papers published by crowdfunding academics to feed us some inspiration.
Great. Okay, and perhaps we should say right at the front why you would want data from the crowdfunding center as opposed to going scraping it yourself or taking it from someone who's just a scraper. Shall I just say something on that first?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so we've been collecting data on all the major platforms and some of the others as well for over 11 years now. We're pushing towards 1 million crowd funds, not just the details you would normally get, but the tracking data or history data, as we call it. So what is that? That's a daily record of the progress of the campaign that tells us how many backers, how many pledges, and other things that may have changed, which just isn't available now. We have many of the projects also that just aren't available anymore. Lots of links. So a very rich data set that, as far as we can tell, just isn't available elsewhere. Hence, we supply a number of universities, some very prestigious ones, and the European crowdfunding report as a part of that. And so that's a bit of background.
Cool. So yeah, folks, please reach out to us. You'll probably see our contact information either on LinkedIn or over email. Please don't hesitate to message us. And in that case, Barry, let's begin. Fantastic. So one of the things that I am persistently seeing as I'm looking at the research pieces by academics is they have to create samples of the data, right? They have to create the specific like groups that they're studying. If you could expand a bit on the capacity of our infrastructure to deal with these sorts of problems, when you need to like set up a cohort, for example, of
Yeah.
companies.
So over the years, we've built in both extensive reporting capabilities, so you can go and get a report and you can slice and dice and have an analysis, an initial analysis via gender, via locale, city, via crowdfunding category. You can use keywords for selection. You can use things like funding target ranges and so on and so on. So very, very flexible. And anything that you can do with those reports, which will just, will give you a good outline of what's in there. And sometimes you see some quite surprising things already in there. You can get the data for it. So you can then download that data. The data is, as much as it can be, checked and pre-cleaned. So we believe this saves quite a bit of time. So, we've tried to make this as easy as possible and as flexible as possible.
And let's say that I've been able to set up a cohort for myself, right? Like, let's say that I'm researching, I don't know, yogurt, right? Like somebody's making a new type of yogurt there. Yogurt may be a bad idea, bad example, but sure, whatever.
Yeah. Let's go really particular. Perhaps we want avocado.
Yeah, particular, that one. let's say that I'm found all of the products that resemble this yogurt thing, um, and I am studying all of them across the years. I want to see how each campaign performed, what this campaign did, what this campaign didn't. Um, how could we do that?
Actually, on that one, rather than using the sort of straight up, selection tools, which you could, I would probably start with our jumpstart capability. So this was really more designed for people who are thinking of running a campaign, but with the jumpstart capability, you can say, look, here's a title, avocado yogurt or
Sure.
yogurt with avocado or whatever. You can give things like a target range.
Mhm.
You can add keywords. You
Mhm.
can list a number of categories. So you might want to put that in the food category, or you
Mhm.
might think it goes in another category as well. So you can put those in and you can run that, and that will go and find you a cohort. In fact,
Mhm.
it will give you a sort of pre-analysis of the cohort, and you can go around that loop a few times to pour, to find what data's there that is useful to you.
Mhm.
And it will give you a report that will, give you the outline of that. It will give you some example projects with links that
Mhm.
you can go and look at. And this is, as I say, designed to be most useful for for people considering a campaign because it's really hard to work out what um, your target might be and what's going to fly. But from this, you can work out what other people have done, what succeeded, what
Mhm.
didn't, the kind of targets they had, the kind of number of funders they were able to
Mhm.
attract, the average pledge, and so on and so on. So it can be a really good way of getting some confidence that you're kind of headed in the right direction and help you make more decisions. And then you can keep going back to the well. So you can then refine that. But from a research point of view, you could use it equally to if you kind of want a particular cohort on, I don't know, underwater basket weaving, someone said one day, in the EU or you could do that if you uh, conversely, if you're really interested in the arts in Minnesota,
Sure. You,
you
you
can
could
do that.
really zoom in on a particular, you know, section, cross section of the market.
Yeah.
Um, what if I want to understand what happened to each of the campaigns in the cohort sequentially day by day? Like
Yeah.
how would I go from looking at this list into drilling in?
Yeah. So we will, have most, if not all, probably all of the data on each of those campaigns, and you can go and try and download it yourself, depending on the quantity. If it's a larger quantity, you can make contact, and we will, we'll look at that with you for you and make that data available for you.
Mhm. Um, so the person would be able, so let's talk a bit more about that part, right? So the person is able to get their hands on data pertaining to each of the, I mean, my presumption is most of the 750,000 campaigns on Kickstarter and Indiegogo um, on a day-by-day basis with the ability to track the delta in the number of backers and the amount of funding they received, and also on the target
Yeah.
number.
Sometimes the targets change as you know,
Yeah.
and you can see other things. So we also, bearing in mind, currency fluctuates.
Hmm.
So we also capture real time value. We use US dollars as a kind of as a lingua franca. being the reserve currency, it was the obvious one to do, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Now the situation is a little different.
Well, yeah, we're in flux, aren't we? Let's not go there.
Sure.
But yes, we sort of capture a conversion. So if it's in euros,
Hmm.
we'll have recorded the dollar value at the time.
Hmm. Um, okay. Now let's shall we jump to specific research examples?
Please, yeah.
And we can go from there. All right. So here is one research question. The title is Crowdfunding as a Market Fostering Gift System. And the takeaway I'm seeing here is crowdfunding acts as a market fostering gift system, enticing consumers to fund market innovations through the logic and practices of gift giving, despite unfavorable conditions and no formal guarantees. So the way I understand it, right, like we are in the BuzzFeed TikTok age where we just go by headlines, we don't actually read.
Yeah, that was the report there, wasn't it? Oh no, sorry, it was just the title.
That was a takeaway. That was a takeaway.
No, I get it.
So let's say that we were a researcher that wants to look at products by the degree to which the product is fit to be a gift, right? Some products are more gifts, some products are less gifts.
Yeah.
Like, how would how would our researcher that's using our platform dig through this?
Okay, that's an interesting one because they've set themselves a bit of a challenge there. I'm really quite interested in that research because if you're kind of approaching this looking for innovative um you know products or whatever, then it's a little bit easier because the challenge I think there, and I haven't read the paper, is that there's lots and lots of stuff that you
Yeah.
probably buy for yourself that you might buy as a gift. uh
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a thing that looks like a gift that is usually thought as a gift.
Yeah. So if I was approaching that, I think my initial approach would be to look at the categories, discount, inappropriate categories,
Hmm.
and then within the categories to try and you could use the data to do some of this work as well, but to try and maybe get a list together of keywords for
Hmm.
things that look particularly gift worthy. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so you build a
You know
dict.
what comes to mind for me is also like maybe to go through, so use our links to the original page and scrape the language of the page for anything that positions this as a present.
Yeah, you could definitely do search on gift as a keyword, and see what that gave you, a sort of scoping exercise. Certainly in the title, yes, and also more generally. So I think that would give you a leap forward in getting a read on this,
Hmm.
what you're looking at, and maybe compiling that dictionary I was talking about.
Hmm. Now, shall we try another paper? See what.
Yeah, let's see where we get.
All right, this is fun. All right, I love this. All right, so take a look. Um, well, actually, here's one interesting topic. Um, COVID-19 happened. Um, COVID-19, like I think like the geopolitical events just kind of like took over the news cycle after it happened, but like it still happened, and it certainly had an impact on the various trade routes, just global macroeconomic situation. So, but it seems that there isn't really that much research on the impact of COVID-19 and crowdfunding and rewards crowdfunding specifically.
Mm,
Because I mean, especially with physical products kind of dominating rewards crowdfunding,
mm,
the question of shipments comes in, supply
mm.
chains, distribution networks, all of that. So how would you think about researching? the impact of COVID-19
Um,
is crowdfunding.
well, I can tell you straight away that we were able to observe just, you know, casually, there was a quite a big impact. So, the data is there, the volumes changed. I suspect the nature of what was being crowdfunded changed significantly as well. I guess it would depend on what my perspective was. So you could come at this particular one from a number of different perspectives, I
Right.
suppose. Are you trying to assess the impact on innovation or economic activity or entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship?
Access to disposable income could also be something to consider, right? Because there are the liquidity events with stimulus payments and
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah, you could certainly look at backer ratings, whether they were
Mhm.
impacted. You could look at the number of nature crowd funds that were launched. There's quite a rich sort of tapestry there, I think,
um,
that you can put us up alongside potentially other data, but this would give you a different read, I think.
yeah. I think it also kind of like as a separate research topic, because crowdfunding, especially when it comes to physical products, right? So if you isolate the market of physical shipped products and you look at the countries from which the Kickstarters or Indiegogos were launched,
Mm.
I mean, I'm afraid that there might not be that much data just from like, on places like Turkey. I don't think that many crowdfunds happened from there. But some amount can be like it's
Mm.
still some data would be there. It would be
Yeah,
really interesting to see how that
it
works.
can it can be quite surprising how much there is.
Mm.
Although I have actually been to Turkey to speak at a crowdfunding conference and to support a local platform. So
Oh,
there is at least one or two local platforms in
yeah.
Turkey, but and we wouldn't capture that.
But I mean specifically rewards crowdfunding.
Yeah, yeah.
Even yeah, like don't people, I mean, isn't like Kickstarter such a international brand that it kind of dominates?
It does in terms of, oh, certainly in terms of volume. I mean, it's difficult to, um, you know, I mean, certainly between them, Indiegogo and Kickstarter, just absolutely in volume, just
Mhm.
are the behemoths, compared to everyone else, and they are global
Mhm.
by and large, with potential exceptions here and there. But and it's, as I say, quite often quite surprising. You can go down really to quite a micro town or city level and still get usable, interesting data very often. And then there's it's worth saying that you know the others aren't. I don't think of them as, they're not also rans. This isn't a two-horse race, because there's tons and tons of other platforms, uh, not least those like Fundraiser and others who are more in other spaces, more in medical,
Mhm.
crowdfunding and other spaces, who are major. And then there's lots of things for film,
Mhm.
and more niche areas who do things that you can't really do in the same way on the major platforms.
Yeah, I've
But
spoken to one guy who at some point wanted to open a crowdfunding platform specifically for game developers.
mm,
And that's like, the moment we started talking about it, about the game publishing industry, how the economics is completely messed up and all that, like it like suddenly made sense. I was like, oh yeah, these guys do need a platform, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
So that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, there have been a number of music dedicated platforms, although I'm happy to be corrected on this, and yeah, I'd love to hear from particular platforms if I'm out of date or wrong on this. But because you can do those things quite well on Indiegogo, uh, well, more so than Kickstarter, you can probably do some of those things on Kickstarter, but certainly on Indiegogo, and it's a really well-trodden path, and it's a kind of life cycle thing where in dance and the arts and music and so many other areas, it's a cyclical thing. It becomes you know
The pre-sale event.
a way of making of reaching the audience and making a living, and then there's things like Patreon as well, of course.
Yeah. Um, in my judgment, Patreon and like buy me a coffee and things like that. I have a Patreon, but like it started it, but like never actually spun it out into anything. Um, they kind of like sit sort of to the side of our industry, which is maybe wrong, like conceptually,
Yeah,
but
I,
they're
I,
kind
I
of
yeah, and I get that, and one of the reasons I'd sort of mention this, I suppose, in that what is Patreon if it isn't crowdfunding? It certainly is, but it's not really quite thought of in that way these days. It's
yeah.
kind of created almost its own niche with some other competitors, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But what is it if it isn't crowdfunding?
I feel like we need them more than they need us.
Mhm. Well, possibly, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they have found a a rich furrow,
Yeah,
and then there's competitors because
yeah.
I couldn't tell you all who they all are and whether they're all still alive, but offering better terms very often and so on.
What is OnlyFans if not crowdfunding?
Pardon?
What is OnlyFans if not crowdfunding?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's moving on.
Yeah,
A lot of it's some other things as well, isn't it?
yeah. All right, so let's
I'm not entirely anti, but it does have a bit of a reputation, I suppose.
oh listen, I am glad for the creators on this platform that they found a way to make a buck.
Yeah,
I understand there are problems with the industry, but still that's better than
yeah.
many other things. All right, so here's a topic. Entrepreneurs backer-oriented behavior and strength. What is this? Entrepreneurs backer strength positively influence reward-based crowdfunding success and high quality content backer-oriented actions being crucial in facilitating fundraising. So, what does backer-oriented behavior mean to you?
Well, first of all, I was going to say you can say that again,
Yeah.
but then I'm not going to ask you to do that because for obvious reasons. But I'm hearing that as this is looking at the way how backer orientated the the entrepreneur
Hmm.
is, and whether it has an impact on success. And the answer is really simple. It's two words. It's hell yeah. I'm I'll be gobsmacked if you can't quickly find proof of that in the data. Um, and I this let me give a little bit of background from my point of view. Obviously, I've spent a lot of years supporting entrepreneurs and so on, and looking at campaigns and understanding campaigns. The besetting sin of every everyone starting out, and quite often businesses more generally, is here I am, this is what I do, as
Hmm.
the starting point. It's kind of a natural human thing,
Hmm.
but backer orientation is starts in a different place. So it starts with, did you know that you know, uh, there's a problem that I think you care about, or that there's something exciting we can do?
Hmm.
Yeah. Uh, Starts from where they're
It's
interested.
an engagement. It's an act of
Yeah,
engagement.
yeah, and it's a flip in terms of perspective, and it's surprisingly hard for people to do. and it's a sort of slippery slope that most people, until they kind of get used to it, come back. Um, so backer orientation is hugely important, but not just in that sense, but also in terms of, if you're smart running a campaign, and you're innovating, you really want to know what is lighting the lights up for people. You really want to know what part of what you're doing is really engaging people, so you can put it up front, or that you can change the way that you're doing or what you're designing or whatever. Because sometimes even quite a small change, can we have it in green? Wow, makes a huge difference, and to the way that people respond, what they're going to back and get into. Um, and so backer orientation is, again, I'd be interested to know what the
What they found.
what the
Yeah.
findings of that report are. But it's almost like, is motherhood a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Well, so the following question is based on another paper. Um, Participation related rewards increase the success chances of crowdfunding campaigns, right? Like, also pretty intuitive thing. Participation related rewards increase success chances of crowdfunding campaigns. So that's actually a topic that I think is pretty difficult to think about sometimes when people are coming up with perks. It's like, if you recognize that crowdfunding is fundamentally a social experience, then some of the rewards, it kind of makes sense to make them have that social component.
Yeah.
So in your imagination experience, what are some of these, what can this look like, participation related rewards?
Um, yeah, and as you say, this is depends what you're doing. Some things lend themselves to this, and others less so. Um, but one of the classic ways of doing this is to say, we're going to name this X, Y, or Z,
Mm.
and we want to hear from you. No, we're not going to call it Boaty McBoatface. Do you remember that? That was a famous thing in the UK, where the government asked the public what they wanted to name this Arctic explorer ship, and the winner was Boaty McBoatface.
That's
Uh,
cute. I think in the 2000s, there were some texting selections.
yeah, yeah,
The for how to name a new 7 Up drink.
yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
not going to openly say what the answer was in it.
I wonder if it had up in it, but never mind. Okay, but there's a moral to this story as
Sure.
well, that they didn't name it that. They named it something, one of the other options,
Yeah.
but they got a huge amount of publicity
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
engagement from the fun of it, right?
Right.
And this is one of a lesson for people who are running campaigns. You know, you can run that kind of campaign, and and still reserve the right to say, no, actually, we're going to choose, one of the others, uh, or but you can get a lot of engagement, and
Yeah, as long as you don't ruin the vibes.
oh yeah, no, you've got to respect people and have a bit of fun with it, and keep to your word. So if you actually say it up front, and whichever one comes top, we're going to name it that. Don't say, we want to know what you think, and we're listening, and all those good things, and take it
Okay.
seriously. Don't don't do it cynically.
I
Uh,
think another good one is I thought about cafes and restaurants doing crowdfunding, because that's like a very frequent thing, especially in investment crowdfunding. And something that occurred to me is that, a reward can be having the right to celebrate your birthday
mm,
at that event,
mm,
at the space,
yeah,
right? So that is, that's always the example I make when I talk about corporate versus
yeah,
corporate funding and corporate restaurants and crowdfunding said like you're not gonna have a birthday party at McDonald's, right? Like that the all of these businesses carry an intrinsic social value.
Yeah, we did some of this during in COVID. Interestingly, we had we created a pivot program to
Hmm.
help businesses stay alive by pivoting to takeaway and so on. But part of it was when we reopen, we're going to have a big party. Right,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
actually, someone is going to get their birthday,
Yeah.
and a cake made, and all of those people love all that sort of thing. Quite rightly, I would say the most successful campaign we ever designed or ran so far. We don't often do it. We kind of pick and choose occasionally, and this was also probably the most fun was we were approached by a firm of accountants, believe it or not, who said, well, there's a local brewery that we work for, and they've run out of space, they need to expand.
Hmm.
It's a great success story, but they need capital, they need to raise an equity crowd fund if they can. Can they run an equity crowd fund? Well, they were a B2B business. They sell to the trade. They've got millions or tens of thousands, only 100,000 maybe, really happy drinkers who love their brand, but no connection with them.
Hmm.
So we said, first of all, no. Secondly, let us think about it. So we went away and thought about it, and we had a brainstorm meeting actually in the brewery. We sat there and asked them a load of questions, and they said, "Do people ever ask for a tour?" Oh yeah, all the time. We get people asking for bloody tours. It's a pain in the bum. We just, well, what do you do? Oh, we tell them to bugger off, basically. That's really okay. Anyway, long story short, I, you know, in the in the sort of design um, or ideation stage, I suggested, okay, what if we ran a piss up in the brewery? Now that's a meme in the UK. Don't know whether it's a meme where whoever you are, but it is there's a saying, someone is incompetent, you couldn't run a piss up in a brewery, right?
Hmm.
And everyone fell about laughing, and it was really really hilarious. And then they got scared. Anyway, long story short,
But by the way, as you were saying this, I was like thinking that, well, if they're distributing the beers in bottles, right? They could nowadays just put like a QR code on the thing, right?
yeah.
To how to build that connection with the user if you don't have a direct contact with the user.
Yeah, this worked much better than that, right?
I
So
mean, listen, I don't think these are exclusive, but because I've seen, um, I mean, I think it's just if you're selling packaged goods,
yeah, but
it can
their
carry an
problem is
advertisement.
people would go to the pub and drink it, and so they wouldn't have a can or whatever.
It was like that. I see.
So the end of the story is
Yeah.
very quickly is what we did is an innovation that not everyone knows about or started using is we
Hmm.
used an event, in fact a series of events, it was so popular,
Hmm.
and it was called a pee up in a brewery,
Yeah.
um, uh, and it attracted huge numbers of people
So that's that
who were
participation.
then saying,
Yeah.
and by the way, I think we were 10,000%, and there was a reason for
Wow.
that as well. All saying, when can we invest? And of course, we now had, as the brewery now had, a prior relationship with all of those
Hmm.
people, making it much, much easier.
So this was an equity campaign
So it laid the foundations for an equity campaign.
but this was a rewards campaign. You
It
pre-sold.
was a rewards campaign, and we deliberately set, a very low target,
Sure.
knowing that we'd smash it to the moon.
Sure. And so what was the reward structure like?
Oh gosh, I'd need to go and look for them all, but there were private tastings probably.
Hmm.
There was, brewery tours. There was the right to name. And the next brew they do
That's
different
cool.
ones every month or whatever. Lots of really engaging, interesting things that
That's
people would
fun.
want to
These
do.
are fun. Yeah. I think like Right. So what would be, I think I saw a research paper about this, but I think it, kind of works. What would be the difference in how you would run a campaign for selling a service, selling services of some sort versus selling packaged products?
Yeah, it's more difficult. It is possible, depending on the service. Uh, I would suggest that the starting point, if you're trying to do this, is, think very, very clearly about why people want or need the service.
Hmm.
Um, and the successful ones, I think, by and large, kind of package the service like a product.
Hmm.
So, a year's subscription, maybe a lifetime subscription, at an appropriate price, or the first 20 are lifetime subscriptions.
Hmm.
Something delivered to your door as a thank you. Um, and find a way to package it. You're never going to have to think about buying a razor ever again, or that's a
Sure.
product, but you get the general idea.
Now, kind of want to take us into a little bit of a different direction. Um, Obviously, we understand that there is a communication pattern from the company, like in the Mint model that you have, right? Like from the center where the company is, the founder is, out to the community,
Yeah.
right? And but the question I want to ask you is, how does um how do the interactions within the community impact the outcome, right? So how
Yeah.
do the social linkages between those people
Yeah.
have an impact?
So let me just briefly paint the picture so that people can kind of see as we're talking about it. So the Mint model is called the Mint model because it looks like a mint with a hole in the middle. In the UK, that's called a polo. In the USA, it's called a lifesaver, I believe. I don't know whether every country in the world has a mint with a hole in the middle, but that's pretty much what it looks like. Or you can think of it as like onion rings. And in the center, as you say, is the entrepreneur. And when you start out, typically, you don't have a brand. You might have dreamt up a brand, but no one's heard of it. It doesn't have a reputation, no brand reputation. So on day one, what's the first circle? Well, the first circle is people who know you, because they don't. You may have started to tell them a little bit about the invention or the product or the innovation, and that's why they're in the circle as well. But it's fundamentally, people that you've got in your network in one way or another. And the challenge in the is then to enlarge that to the next level, because the next level is full of people by definition who've never heard of you. They have no reason to know whether you know what you're doing or to trust you. And when you kind of analyze the stats, and we did, and all of this is in the book New Routes to Funding, um, uh, that's out there at Amazon. When you analyze the stats, basically, until you get that first circle built to a reasonable size so that you get a burst of activity when you start your campaign, um, unless you do that, your campaign is not going to take off. It just doesn't. And a good percentage of campaigns just fall flat because they don't understand that, they don't do that. But fundamentally, the challenge, because that's your credibility, right? And just think about it like this, you're kind of swiping through campaigns late at night. You see one with one backer, or two or three, and you
Mhm.
move on, right? You see one with 20, 30, you see one with 100. Oh, what's that about? So it kind of, there's a natural human process we all use about, do I know this person, or
Mhm.
do I know anyone who knows this?
Mhm.
Who are they? How is there a
Yep.
relationship? Uh, and obviously, it's a rolling process if you get it right. So you enlarge that circle of people who know you or know your brand. And as more people come to look, you've got more backers, you've got more pledges. That gives you more credibility. And so what you're doing is you're starting with a no brand or a brand with no reputation, and you're building that through your relationships, through building, that. So, um, uh, and this is how the Mint model explains it.
How would you incentivize? So if I'm going to people on the outer layer, right? Like people that I somewhat know, but like maybe, or maybe how would I even ask my close friends uh, to share with their community about us, right? Like, because if people knowing each other increases the probability of conversion, like what would be the ways to incentivize information sharing with the broader community?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of pretty standard social media stuff, isn't it? So everyone, more or less has got a network these days. Um, and if they're passionate about whatever it is, they will naturally want to tell
Mhm.
their people about it. Encouragement goes a long way as well. Uh, if if they're just interested,
Yeah.
a little bit different. Um, uh, some platforms, uh, like the ones connected to Fundraiser, have really interesting mechanisms built into them to
Mhm.
encourage and support this, and they do have an impact. So the connection point platforms are very, very smart. They're industry leading.
Mhm.
And I'll say hi to Daryl at that point. Um, because they encourage that, they actually integrate it in. Incentivizing, you've got to be careful with, because you want people to do it on the basis of interest and passion rather than paying them or whatever, because
I suppose incentive is not the right word here. Like
yeah.
encourage, yeah.
The point I want to make, though, is it's clear in the research, in the psychology, that uh, a, a, a monetary reward, a visceral reward, can de-incentivize an intrinsic reward. So the intrinsic reward of sharing something I'm passionate
Yeah.
about. But
That's true.
go back to Boaty McBoatface. It's hilarious. You want to tell people about it.
Yeah, yeah. You retain some of that animalistic whatever, like they're not even animalistic, just childish joy from connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, all right. So that's actually, oh, that's fantastic. So here is one takeaway. Um, here is I'm reading it out. Rewards with utilitarian and participatory values positively impact restaurant crowdfunding success, while oh my God, this is brutal. While socio-emotional value has no significant effect. That's the takeaway. Rewards with utilitarian and participatory value positively impact restaurant crowdfunding success, while socio-emotional value has no significant effect.
Um, okay.
Interesting.
That's pretty counterintuitive. I'm going to guess that that's an equity-based study, is it?
I believe we're talking about rewards crowdfunding. Yeah, this is rewards crowdfunding.
And are you able to mention an author or the authors?
Yes. So that was Professor Kedas and Professor Sarkar. Um, Reward-based crowdfunding, that's the title. Reward-based crowdfunding, how make it work. And this is the takeaway from this was an AI generated takeaway, right? So this is not like an abstract or anything like that. So maybe AI saw something differently. Perhaps it's also a question of the definitions assigned to, because you see it says rewards with utilitarian and participatory values. So participatory values could be interpreted as socio-emotional value.
Yeah, that's I'm not surprised it's an AI summary, let's put it that way. Um, because AI does have a tendency to impose a common view, rather than sort of deeper thought. So I'd like to see that at some point and maybe look at that.
Yeah, I'm gonna send it to you. I'm looking at that research right now. Yeah, so the article is called "Putting Your Money Where Your Mouth Is: The Role of Rewards and Value-Based Understanding of Restaurant Crowdfunding." All right, fantastic. I'll send it to you. All right, cool. Barry, shall we continue?
Let's do just one or two more.
All right, sounds great. Let's take a look. You know what? Would be very interesting to hear your thoughts about the patterns of knowledge sharing with the entrepreneurs community from the perspective of the entrepreneur.
Yeah, one of the things that is very clear in the data is that crowdfunding success uh, very often clusters, and clusters geographically and in quite a striking manner. Um, and what that looks like, I think, is that um, there's a lot that is not necessarily entirely intuitive about running designing and running a crowdfund. And, it's not quite cracking the code, although some people put it that way, but kind of getting to work out the heartbeat of it, the dynamic of it, and how to use it fluently is a skill. Um, but once you have someone in your area, um, who knows how to do that, particularly if it's a collaborative sort of artistic or similar milieu, and they're kind of willing to, talk about their journey, which very often people are. We ran a number of crowdfunding hubs in places like Bristol, Leeds, Sheffield. We had a request for 100 of them, which including Sydney, Australia, Washington DC, and other places, which stretched us a little. But the point is when you can when you can interact and learn from people like you, because that's a big thing in the a kind of local thing. Um, those skills then can multiply. So then you can start to get a scene, if you like, in a particular town or city that know how to do dance crowdfunding, or know
So
how
it's
to
kind of
do.
it like kind of becomes like a cool thing to do. It becomes like a culturally accepted behavior.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. It becomes a norm,
Mhm.
and I think that goes alongside the skills as well. But there's a very good point.
What's the okay, so if you were to track the what happens before it becomes a norm, right? Like what are the stages to it becoming a norm in a given place?
It's a really good question. You've just reminded me I've been at a number of universities, one in particular, teaching on this, and in one or two occasions, one of the blunter academics has said, well, it's begging.
Mhm.
Um, and they're utterly wrong, but you're never going to convince them of that.
How to expose your own social problems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, very often the case, isn't it? But so um we all know that the depiction of crowdfunding in the media is
Sure.
very narrow, and not at all helpful or accurate. So that's one of the barriers, I think. Um,
Yeah.
so stages, there's something really powerful about seeing someone. It's a role model, isn't it? Someone who you can relate to,
Hmm.
and go, looking at them and go, I'd like to do that, or better still, I could do that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that that realization of oh, just this is accessible. This is something that becomes a possibility for me is a big step, possibly the first big step in terms of moving on. And then, oh, but how would I do it?
Mhm. That's 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 the
And
following challenge.
then having the impetus to say, okay, let me go and find out how to do it.
But the thing is that like I think if it became a norm in your community to do this, then you know exactly the pathway of raising that money, right? It's not as difficult to assemble all these people again.
Mm.
It's not as difficult to kind of come to their doorstep or shoot a message because the trail has been blazed. Um, so it would be an interesting social study to see like the challenge and the breakthrough to making of the norm. At what point does the ball begin to roll in terms of people kind of accepting it?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And bear in mind, we've got sort of even within a locality, you've got different communities.
Yeah.
The dance community, are not necessarily integrated with the academic community or the
Well, that's another
the
thing. If you
music
can
community.
study the level of integration between communities in a given space,
Mm,
in a given locale,
mm.
right? You could kind of you could almost use crowdfunding as a test of level of integration of communities.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be sophisticated research, but I'm certain now we've got plenty enough data to be able to track the rise of crowdfunding success and skill. Maybe success as a initially a marker for skill. Within territories and within arts communities and similar.
I would look at the data on go from the campaign data into the personal data of the founders.
Yeah.
It's just try to understand what's going on, what's happening in their like
Mm.
Facebook, for example, page. How many
Yeah.
groups are they a part of? How many friends do they have? Who shared the thing? I mean, that would be a crazy amount of scraping that I don't think Facebook would even allow. But that could be
Yeah.
an interesting topic.
There have got some starting points. I mean, one of the noticeable things in the data is wherever there's a platform based down in Cornwall, one of the platforms, there's a
Mhm.
sort of natural cluster of activity. Where, as I say, we run a number of hubs. As I mentioned before, and that would be another potential starting point to look at the impact of that, how it rose and uh, either stayed or decayed over time.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, I wonder. I wonder like how public policy scholars can use it, or and social science scholars, right? Like to use crowdfunding as a more social science than public policy, but like use crowdfunding as a proxy of human behavior.
Well, one of the areas um, in related to public policy is
Hmm.
local economic development.
Hmm.
And a number of areas have realized that this is a unique lens for them.
Hmm.
And this is one of the reasons we have the City Insights tool. So, um, you know, it can tell you about the, otherwise largely invisible economic activity and interest of entrepreneurs in the area through the crowdfunding activity in the area. And Oregon Capital Scan, for one, have made good use of the data and combined it with some of their, the more equity data. And there's yeah, I think it was Minnesota,
Mhm.
Minneapolis, in Minnesota, that did something similar that spring immediately to mind. So we know that there's, really interesting data here that can be used in that sort of way as a
Mhm.
mapping tool, but also, um, the going back to things like Jumpstart, there's a tool that can be used within those, entrepreneurial environments to support, entrepreneurs and so on.
Yeah. Okay, Barry. I think we're good now. Thank
Okay,
you
well,
all
that's been
for.
that's been an interesting conversation. I shall pick up the threads from that, and I'm sure we'll have another one again
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
soon,
hopefully
Peter.
soon.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Let's end it.